expecting this bell to go off, and it'll probably be in the middle of your deep thought.
I don't have thoughts that deep.
So one leave. As soon as this is over, we'll do, you got lunch until 2 o'clock. So my suggestion is to eat downstairs just to save time, because you need to try it out. And you can get fancy Starbucks coffee, I think, of course you got to pay for it. And I don't know what else they're having. It's fall break, and that's why you don't see many students, which is kind of good because it'd be so noisy in this building, you wouldn't be able to hear the speakers. Okay, so for this panel, Dr. Adkison, who's from Oklahoma State University, I've known him forever. His distinction is whatever I do, he criticizes me, and this has gone on for years and years. And so he's an expert in constitutional law, what else is an expert in? Religion and criticism, and so he's going to chair the panel. And I think one of our panel members probably is not going to show up, but you never know. There's surprises all the time.
Okay.
Probably right after the bell goes off.
Well, we'll handle that if it happens. So, we have 3 individuals that are 2 presenters, is that right?
That's correct.
We'll have Professor Savage and Riddlesperger, who is co-authored a piece with Professor Key. And
I'm just going to sit here.
okay, that's fine. I suggest we go in the order in which we're listed. That's all right with everyone. So if you're ready to present, Professor Savage will give you the floor.
Thank you.
All right, well, my paper's title is Presidential Party Leadership, TR and FDR. And I don't know if I call it exactly I only minored in English, not majored, exactly an oxymoron, maybe a non sequitur to use the terms presidential party leadership, because this is something every president, of course, finds out, like Barack Obama right now, concerning trying to round up enough Democratic votes for the Trans-Pacific trade agreement and so forth. How do you get most members of his own party, let's say in Congress, to vote for something that he as a Democratic president wants? And where, recently in the Democratic debate, the 2 leading candidates, and believe it or not, they're not Jim Webb and they're not Martin O'Malley, but Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders both come out against the Trans-Pacific trade deal. And so again, the question, is it possible for any president to be a truly effective or successful party leader? And I guess if you just look at it in that very simple statement, or if you do what political scientists used to do in this country, not so much today anymore with UKIP and all that kind of stuff going on in Great Britain, but we would compare to what used to be the very strong, centralized, disciplined 2-party system of Great Britain or the UK. And of course, if you look at it that way, the answer, is no, because we have the separation of powers, we have federalism, and then we have, of course, all the consequences of the Progressive era. Of course, it was during the Progressive era that Teddy Roosevelt was president, and then tried to become president again as the nominee of the so-called Bull Moose or Progressive Party in 1912. This is when Franklin Roosevelt began to develop his political career. And of course, the Progressives believed that strong centralized political parties and party leaders, especially when the party leader has a chief executive role in government, like mayor or governor or president, that's a source of corruption. In government, it means a lot of patronage jobs, it means a lot of pork barrels, kind of even more than today. It means all kinds of anti-small d democratic practices, like having a lot of dead people voting and stuffed ballot boxes and things like that. So in short, if you want government to be more honest and efficient, and if you want politics to be more honest and small d democratic and participatory, it means weakening political parties and weakening any kind of significant power for, let's say, ultimately the president as the titular or unofficial quote-unquote leader of his political party. So I have to sort of mention all that to then speak about party leadership in general and comparing TR and FDR in relative terms, these very specific relative terms, not sort of in absolute terms. Within this context, because my thesis is not terribly earth-shattering or unique, is that yes, Franklin Roosevelt was a more effective and successful party leader than TR, both in the short term and the long term. As other paper presenters have mentioned, we really don't hear Republican presidential candidates today, especially maybe somebody like Ted Cruz, talking about, we need another Republican president like, Teddy Roosevelt, or even like Eisenhower, or something like that. We don't hear it, but still we certainly see echoes of Franklin Roosevelt and his party leadership in various proposals from, Hillary Clinton, or even, Bernie Sanders, who just joined the Democratic Party in April, as far as I know. It wasn't until he filed his nomination papers that he actually became a Democrat. But within this, Ralph Goldman is somebody who studied the two national parties and presidential party leadership, and also the role of party chairman, national party chairman, the RNC and DNC chairman. And he developed a sort of typology, and said, I'll quote from it, where under his different categories and the criteria for them, he categorizes Franklin Roosevelt as a so-called partisan presidential party leader, and TR as a so-called transpartisan presidential party leadership. And this is what he means by, partisans like FDR have been, quote, have been explicit, articulate, even unabashedly proud of their party affiliation, relatively active in the party's management, and willing to solicit and campaign on behalf of the party, end quote. TR, on the other hand, he categorizes as transpartisan, meaning that TR's... Oh, okay.
It'll probably do that 5 more times.
In Indiana, it's do like a tornado warning or something. I'm going to go to the basement. Okay. That transpartisan in the sense that his identification, in his case with the Republican Party, was sort of quite intentionally so weak and so conditional that what was more important to him were certain political principles, certain policy goals, and that in order to achieve them, he was certainly willing to not only leave his political party, as he did, at least temporarily, and weaken it enough to contribute to a major electoral defeat, like namely, basically, ultimately handing the presidency over to Woodrow Wilson, a man whom he always detested. I mean, it seems like his hatred for Wilson only grew over time for all kinds of reasons. And that transparent in the sense that he was trying to, within a rather short period of time, great burst of energy and activity, if he couldn't change his party in the way he wanted to, ideologically and programmatically, then he was going to, in effect, create a new political party. And of course, that was going to be the so-called Bull Moose or Progressive Party. And so, from there, it's not terribly surprising to look at the results. FDR was more successful than TR. But why was he? What were the reasons? I think that's what, in terms of my primary and secondary research, I did some additional research at the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park this summer on this. And I think one thing has to do with the origins of their relationships with their two political parties. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, was son of TR Sr., and Theodore Roosevelt Sr. was primarily a businessman and a philanthropist. It's probably his major contribution to philanthropy and to the Union cause in the Civil War was the development of sort of this allotment system where Union soldiers could have their pay put aside and sent back home to their families. So he sort of organized all of that. But he pretty much, and so he was also interested and involved in some other philanthropic activities. But TR Sr., again, primarily saw politics as, again, just very corrupting, and really didn't want to have anything to do with it, never wanted to pursue a career in politics. And then finally, and quite reluctantly, he later on he did accept nomination to be collector of the Port Authority for the New York, basically the customs collector for the Port of New York, which of course was kind of ironic because that he's talking about corruption. That was by far the top #1 patronage dispenser in the nation, and of course a source of a lot of money coming in, probably more than any, I'm sure, any other port in the country, when it came to all the revenue from high protective tariffs, would of course go through the customs house in New York. But the idea, of course, was to kind of clean up the customs house by appointing T.R. Sr. to that position. And there was a lot of opposition to his appointment in the Senate. And so a lot of the Republican machine bosses, Republican business interests, the so-called old guard conservative Republicans, did everything they could to defeat him. And finally, of course, he was defeated. And then a few weeks later, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., he's relatively young at the time, 47, 48 years old, I believe, died of this gastrointestinal disease or problem. And TR, and I think this is significant, the reason I tell this whole story, TR, for the rest of his life, always had this bitterness about machine bosses and patronage and corruption within the Republican Party. I think a lot of it kind of goes back to the fact that he believed that his father's death was at the very least hastened by, and maybe even caused by, this fight over his nomination to that particular position. And so TR gets into, of course, Republican Party politics. Unlike his father, he seeks elective positions and appointed positions in government. But again, always with this eye towards, doing everything good. He can't actually get rid of the Republican machine bosses and corrupting business influences in the Republican Party. At least try to weaken them. At least try to subordinate them as much as possible within a bigger tent Republican Party that would be more liberal or more progressive, in terms of his mentor, Abraham Lincoln, make it once again truly Abraham Lincoln's party, not the party of plutocrats and big business and corrupt machine bosses and so forth. Franklin Roosevelt, on the other hand, of course, was a Democrat, partially because of inheritance, but Franklin Roosevelt's father never sought or wanted any elected positions in the Democratic Party. And it seems that Franklin Roosevelt's father, James, pretty much became a Democrat, not for any deep political thinking, is because he had some friends who were Democrats. He became friends with Grover Cleveland, become friends with George McClellan. So on that basis, what the heck? They seem like nice guys who are Democrats. I'll be a Democrat. But being a Democrat really seemed to have no influence on his political thinking. For James Roosevelt, he was one of the gold Democrats who opposed William Jennings Bryan, and was, again, pretty conservative, almost no economic issues, really no difference from other upper class WASP Republicans in the Northeast at that time. And so there wasn't that sort of paternal connection, really, for Franklin Roosevelt with his father that the TR, I think, always had. And then, of course, in terms of the machine bosses, of course, Franklin Roosevelt developed a very different kind of relationship with Democratic machine bosses, not just when he was president, but even earlier, when he was even in the New York State Senate. When he was in the state Senate, Franklin Roosevelt quickly realized that, not all of these guys who are from Tammany Hall are really that bad. I've met people like Al Smith and people like Robert Wagner, and they often want to achieve a lot of the same policy goals, that I do in terms of reform. And then, of course, Roosevelt also quickly figured out, FDR did, I should say, how useful machine bosses were. They could deliver blocks of delegate votes in conventions. The reformers, Eleanor Roosevelt's people, they could give all kinds of speeches about idealism and political principles, but in terms of actually getting the power of the votes, the machine bosses could deliver in all kinds of ways. So he quickly kind of made all kinds of political and ethical accommodations with machine bosses quite early in his career. Then I think differences in personalities and values that affected their party leadership and then ultimately made Franklin Roosevelt, a more successful party leader. As other people have mentioned, TR was an intellectual. I think in many ways a closet intellectual, because I think there's also the part of TR who was the big game hunter and the almost comic book level Superman, going into the jungle and becoming a cowboy for a while, and the Battle of San Juan Hill and all this kind of stuff. That maybe thought this is come between being intellectual and all this machismo. So, but still, he was somebody who was a big reader. He had a lot of different intellectual interests, naval history and zoology and botany and this, that, and soil and forest conservation, this, that, and the other thing. Franklin Roosevelt certainly was not an intellectual, I think, in that sense of the word. He's never known as being a really big book reader. Franklin Roosevelt primarily got his information and his learning by listening to people. And I think it's one of the ways in which ultimately his polio, turned almost to become somewhat of a political asset for him, because people would have to come and see him. He wouldn't go and see them. They would come and see him at Hyde Park, and then later the White House to give him information and advice. And I think partially because of that, TR was more idealistic. I think he was more, therefore, ideological than Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt was more pragmatic, and I think more of an experimenter. Ideas are only good in terms of if they prove to be useful, whether useful in winning elections or useful in achieving certain policy goals. Franklin Roosevelt, for both better and worse, I think he was also more Machiavellian, more devious than TR. He was more likely to kind of hold his tongue and not make speeches which could ultimately come back and hurt him politically in various ways. But then I think some of the similarities between the two of them is that for both TR and FDR, although TR slightly more so than FDR, their party identification and loyalty were not absolute. They were conditional. I think more conditional for TR than FDR. I think for both of them, ideology and policy identity were more important than just blind party loyalty. They both made it clear at various times that within the American two-party system, they wanted to make their political party, first TR and the Republican Party, and then Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party, the so-called liberal party within the two-party system. Now, what do we mean by liberal? Over the years I've heard all kinds of different definitions. Someone saying that, a conservative is a liberal who is mugged by reality. I've heard someone say, you're a liberal if your child joins the Marines, and you ask yourself, where did I go wrong? What do we mean by liberal? Well, liberal is rooted in the progressive era notion that we should have, more government intervention, ultimately through the federal government, on a larger number of issues. First, in terms of big businesses, regulating them in various ways, breaking up the so-called trusts and monopolies, protecting consumers, new social welfare benefits, legal rights and protections for labor unions, and so forth and so on. And of course, later on, greater protection through the federal government of civil rights and civil liberties. And Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt made a couple of interesting speeches in all this, in terms of what being a Democrat should mean and connecting into liberalism. Just a few weeks after the 1938 midterm elections, where the Republicans did very well, I think they made a net gain of more than 80 or 81 seats in the House of Representatives. Roosevelt's purge campaign, at least had been a failure in the immediate sense of failing to defeat for renomination a lot of the Democrats, mostly in the South, to be targeted for defeat in the primaries. But still, just a few weeks after the 1938 elections, in his January 1939 speech to young Democrats, Roosevelt stated that if the Democratic Party nominated a conservative for president in 1940, he would, quote, find it impossible to have any active part in such an unfortunate suicide of the old Democratic Party, end quote. And then shortly after he was reelected to a third term as president in 1941, Roosevelt, in a public statement, wrote, I believe it to be my sworn duty as president to make steps necessary to ensure the continuance of liberalism in our government. I believe at the same time that it is my duty as the head of the Democratic Party to see to it that my party remains the truly liberal party in the political life of America. In a system of party government such as ours, however, elections become meaningless when the two parties have no differences other than their labels. And then one more quote from Franklin Roosevelt, again says something similar. This is from 1939. FDR told his fellow Democrats, quote, this was at a Jackson Day dinner, if there are nominal Democrats who, as a matter of principle, a Democratic Tweedledum to a Republican Tweedledee, it is on the whole better that the issue be drawn within the party, justifying the whole purge campaign effort, that the fight be fought, and that if the Tweedledums are defeated, they join the Tweedledees. So, in short, if you were according to Franklin Roosevelt's definition, an anti-New Deal conservative Democrat, in particular if at this time you opposed the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, then get out of the party. If you consider yourself a conservative in terms of that particular litmus test for policy, that get out, create your own new political party, or become a Republican. And of course, this later on influences political scientists. A few years after Franklin Roosevelt dies in 1950, the American Political Science Association issued this report entitled "Toward a More Responsible Two-Party System." And again, basically what it meant was that we should have a two-party system the way Britain has its two-party system at this time, right after World War II. The Labour Party, which is its ideology and policy agenda, and membership in Parliament, definitely based on socialism. You've got a conservative party, more or less sort of mixed capitalism is its economic basis, and it's consistent and clear in its ideology and rhetoric and policy behavior on that. In short, give the voters a real choice when it comes to a two-party system. And I think and of course Franklin Roosevelt, as we know, continued to preside over the party where Southern whites were still very powerful within it, especially within the committee system of Congress and the chairmanships of major committees. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, and maybe in some ways more similar to TR, her uncle, than FDR, her husband on this, more ideological, perhaps more idealistic, but also maybe more somewhat unrealistic politically, would tell her husband to do things like, support this, federal anti-lynching legislation in Congress, support this and that, or do something else that's much more, supportive of civil rights for African Americans. And what Franklin Roosevelt used to always tell Eleanor again and again was, first you have to get the votes, and then you can do the good work. So it was always paramount, I think, in Franklin Roosevelt's mind, for better or worse, whatever ethical, problems this creates, is, winning is very important. First and foremost, as a politician, you have to be consistently successful in winning elections in order to get the power, so that eventually you can do at least some good work, however belated and compromised, and maybe too little later on, but at least you have to win the elections. I think now swing back to TR. TR, unlike FDR, was willing to risk, obviously, electoral defeat. He was willing to take that chance in order to, again, try to move his party, the Republican Party, in the policy and ideological direction that he wanted. And when he was obviously very frustrated by this with the presidency of William Howard Taft, and then with the way he was treated at the Republican National Convention of 1912. It wasn't just that, obviously, as most people, even TR probably expected, the party regulars renominated Taft, but the way that his delegates were treated, the way just a lot of chicanery was going on in favor of Taft and against his candidacy at the 1912 Republican National Convention, he then, of course, agrees to become the Progressive Party's nominee. Teddy wrote, TR, I shouldn't say Teddy, because from what I've read, he hated being called Teddy. TR, of course, became, I think, even more ideological, more liberal, and somewhat more politically unrealistic, of course, after he left the presidency, because when he was president, of course, he did need to in order to get things done in the legislative process, compromise with more conservative Republicans who controlled Congress at that time. But a major influence on TR after he left the presidency was Herbert Croly's book, The Promise of American Life. Croly was one of the founders of the New Republic magazine, and what Croly basically said was that the United States, kind of like whipping a dead horse with so-called trust busting, all these antitrust lawsuits, based on the Sherman Antitrust Act and later the Hepburn Act. We're going to have more and more big business in this country. It's inevitable. And so, if anything, we need a bigger, more powerful federal government, especially a bigger, more powerful presidency to regulate big business and not do it so-called trust busting, trying to go back to smaller businesses. We heard almost like Larry David impersonating Bernie Sanders suggesting this on Saturday Night Live. Get the big banks and break them up into little pieces, kind of thing. But if you're going to have big business, have a big enough federal government to regulate it and have even a cooperative relationship with big business. To make it clear to big business, if you're going to operate, you need to ultimately serve the public good in economics, not just your own profits and economic power. And then it was almost, again, this sort of Hamiltonian notion of having government involved with big business and big banks to develop the economy and supervise it in such a way that you're going to have a greater economic good and greater economic justice for the average American. And what's going to go along with that is going to be legal rights and powers for labor unions and social welfare benefits and so forth and so on. So that then becomes the basis for the so-called new nationalism for Teddy Roosevelt in his 1910 speech in Kansas, and then in the 1912 the 1912 progressive platform. It's also a big influence on Franklin Roosevelt's Commonwealth Club address of 1932, where it was really difficult. You look at Franklin Roosevelt's perhaps somewhat Machiavellian, devious pragmatism as a political actor. When he ran for president in 1932, there were times when Franklin Roosevelt was saying, basically, I'm like a small government Jeffersonian Democrat. These Republicans spend too much money. We've had this big increase in the federal bureaucracy under Herbert Hoover. I'm going to promise to balance the federal budget. It's a promise in Pittsburgh in 1932. So you make those kinds of speeches, which Southern Democrats in particular like to hear. But then on the other hand, he makes the Commonwealth Club address, which is pretty much kind of a synopsis of the new nationalism and Herbert Croly's The Promise of American Life, where that you need to forget about this ultimately self-destructive, cannibalistic competition in capitalism. Look at all the damage it's done. Instead, again, have this sort of more or less a planned economy of economic cooperation. But when it came to dealing with
Not a lot.
Not a lot. Okay.
A couple minutes, maybe.
Couple minutes. Okay. Sort of one other thing I want to mention in terms of party leadership are relations with each party's national chairman. I think nowadays it's hard for us to imagine how incredibly powerful in-party Republican national chairmen in particular once were. When TR becomes president following McKinley's assassination, Mark Hanna was the Republican national chairman, besides also being a senator from Ohio. And, of course, Hanna had actively and vigorously opposed TR's nomination for vice president in 1900. He kept referring to that damn cowboy. And there was serious talk that he was going to run against TR for the Republican presidential nomination of 1904, and that as Republican national chairman, Hanna actually could win. That as Republican national chairman, he had enough control over patronage, which is still substantial at that time, and that he had enough connections as a senator with other Republicans in Congress. Plus, he was very well connected to the Rockefeller family and Standard Oil and other big business interests in the Republican Party. That he could, really do it. He could really, as Republican national chairman, become the nominee. But actually, he becomes seriously ill. decided not to pursue that. And so during actually his first term as president, TR was somewhat moderate and pragmatic because he felt that he had to be. But then once he got elected president in his own right in 1904, of course he became a sort of more ideological, had more public conflicts with more conservative Republicans. And of course he did something which even Franklin Roosevelt did not do as a dying man on the night that he was reelected to a fourth term in 1944. He made himself a lame duck. TR said, he wasn't going to run for president again in 1908. And so, of course, I think this frustrated TR in trying to deal with Republicans in Congress, and again, sort of helped him move further and further to the left. He becomes sort of more, again, bombastic, more openly critical of and opposed to conservatives and machine bosses and big business interests in his party, and again, ultimately leading to the whole Vote Lose campaign, which obviously really, we see today, really doesn't have any kind of long-term noticeable effects within the Republican Party.
All right. Thank you. Let's see, we'll have questions at the end, I guess. Is that okay? Well, as I said a minute ago, with our second paper, written by Riddlesperger and Dean, and full review. Should give you about the same amount of time.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Jim King and I have been working in the area of presidential appointments and management of the bureaucracy for more than 30 years, and we made a decision about 20 years ago that we would not split our presentations, but rather take turns in making our presentations. And so, for better or worse, I'm the lucky one. Probably worse, I'm the lucky one today. Stephen Shaw made a disparaging comment about Texans and their use of English language, which of course is entirely appropriate. I'm not only teaching Texas, but I am a native Texan, and despite that disadvantage, I'm going to go ahead and go forward. Your other alternative, of course, is someone from Battle Creek, Michigan, who almost always talks about Post and Kellogg's cereals in any of his presentations. So, you have to pick your poison with us. I am from Texas, which is a really interesting state, particularly in the Franklin Roosevelt era. Of course, the Theodore Roosevelt era was an era where Texans were almost irrelevant in national politics because they were all Texans in a Republican-dominated era. But unlike that, they'd been waiting for a long time to have influence. And when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president, of course, he chooses a Texan as his first running mate, John Nance Garner, who was the incumbent Speaker of the U.S. House, and in that role really played a huge role in helping Franklin Roosevelt in his first term, which was really interesting because Garner himself, of course, was by nature a very conservative man, and he abandoned Roosevelt soon after the court packing plan was announced, and by 1938 was kind of actually backstabbing Franklin Roosevelt in the last 2 years of Roosevelt's term. And of course, you had the Hatton Sumners, who was kind of the chief blocker of the court packing plan, was from Dallas, and two of Roosevelt's strongest supporters, who were very influential in politics, of course, were Sam Rayburn and Lyndon Johnson. So it's an interesting story to tell. And by the way, Sean, I think that you mentioned John O'Connor in your paper. Of all the interesting things in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, the one that I would always like to have been is at an O'Connor family reunion, because John O'Connor was, of course, a Tammany Hall machine politician who was the object of the purge in 1938, and Franklin Roosevelt's law partner and best friend and the manager of the Warm Springs Foundation, which became the March of Dimes, was Basil O'Connor, John's brother. So there must have been some really interesting things going on there. But let's go forward. Jim King and I have been looking at kind of the circumstances that presidents come to office and how that impacts the way that they build a president and wield their power. How do they use the bureaucracy to accomplish the goals that they want to accomplish? And we have studied really presidents beginning with Harry Truman, and there was a reason for that. We wrote a paper one time where someone asked us to include Harry Truman, so we went back and added him to our data set. So that's as far back as we've gone, really. So this is kind of new territory for us, going backwards. But our study has really been about the institutional presidency. The cabinet departments having very institutional responsibilities, the established executive office of the president, and a very institutional White House staff. And how does that mean that the president goes about building an administration? And we've seen some very interesting trends in looking at the differences of the circumstances of the president. So there are 4 different kinds of transitions into the presidency, and I'm going to talk about them in terms of kind of their historical relevance to this presidency, or to this paper. The first is what we call an unexpected transition. An unexpected transition takes place when a president dies in office and his vice president becomes president, or in the case of Richard Nixon, when you resign and your vice president becomes president. And one of the things that we notice here is that transition presidents are always timid. And the reason they're timid in terms of their party leadership is they feel like they've inherited an office that belonged to someone else. And so they try to temper what they do with both putting their imprint on the office and also paying appropriate homage to their predecessor. And so that's a very typical reaction for that. In the institutional presidency era, we notice that there's a lot of twinning going on, or what someone's called the Noah's Ark phenomenon, where there's 2 of everybody. Because not only do you have the old president's advisor in this area, but you have the new president's advisor in this area, and they kind of work together, sometimes uncomfortably. We don't see that in the pre-institutional era. It doesn't seem to be the case with either Franklin or Theodore. The second kind of transition is something that many scholars have really kind of overlooked, and that is the second-term transition. Now, in the case of Franklin Roosevelt, of course, he had 3 second-term transitions. He's the only president to do that. But in this case, presidents often re-guide their presidency at the change of terms. It's their last chance to really make a difference in what they are going to try to accomplish. And there's often more than a 50% turnover in the president's senior staff between the first term and the second term. And that's been pretty standard, particularly since Richard Nixon was president. And the third kind of transition is what we would call an intra-party transition, a transition between an elected president of a political party and his successor, who happens to be in the political party as well. And of course, that happens when Theodore Roosevelt hands the presidency off to William Howard Taft. And one of the things we find here is that that's always an ugly process. There's sniping and backbiting and backstabbing from within the party as the preceding president leaves office, feeling that his successor owes the presidency to him and should carry on with the policies that he has begun, and the successor president saying, I want to be president on my own and I don't want anything to do with your people. And of course, guess what? The Roosevelt to Taft transition is exactly that way. In fact, it may be the nastiest of all, because of their difference in policy and also in their approach to the presidency. And then finally, there is the inter-party transition, which is a transition from a president of one party to an elected president of the other party. That's the most typical kind of transition. Most of our transitions in American history have been of that kind. And what's really interesting here is that the Herbert Hoover to Franklin Roosevelt transition is a very typical case of that kind of transition. Okay, so let me kind of be brief here in going through the case studies kind of in our paper. It is clear that Theodore Roosevelt felt that he had inherited McKinley's presidency. He wanted to be loyal to McKinley in terms of paying homage to the fact that he had been elected to serve as president. But of course, after he got into office, he soon was chomping at the bit to make a difference. That didn't really show up in the cabinet. Roosevelt, because of his high energy, I think wore out cabinet members. There was a lot of turnover in his cabinet, but it didn't seem to be particularly to try to recast the presidency. So He did want to transform the Republican Party back to what he thought was to the party of Lincoln, a reformer party, a progressive party, and yet he confronted William McKinley's cabinet, which one biographer has said was an orthodox phalanx of conservative Republicans. I love that terminology. Edmund Morris uses that in his book. And Roosevelt, of course, was anything but that. And so some members of McKinley's cabinet, most notably Lyman Gage, who wrote in his memoirs, that he thought Roosevelt was a reckless personality. Well, you can imagine Orthodox Republicans thinking that. And Gage tried to stay in Roosevelt's cabinet, but just couldn't stand it and left in about 6 months. On the other hand, Hay, the Secretary of State, stayed right on and became the author of the Good Neighbor policy. So he adjusted very well to the Theodore Roosevelt administration. In the second, and I'm going to say very little about the second term transition of Theodore Roosevelt, because it really wasn't much of one. There were, in fact, 6 of the 9 cabinet members who changed office during that time, but it clearly was not part of an orchestration of change. It was part of a kind of regular turnover in the cabinet. Indicative of this, of course, is the case of Elihu Root, who had been Secretary of War for William McKinley. He leaves office to go back to his corporate law practice in kind of toward the end of the first term of Theodore Roosevelt. And then when the opening comes at stake, when Hay dies, Elihu Root is invited to come back into the administration as Secretary of State, and reluctantly does so. He was making good money on Wall Street, but he did come back, and so we had that kind of changeover. But again, not part of any kind of a systematic turnover. Very quickly on the Roosevelt to Taft transition at the end of Roosevelt's presidency. Taft had been Roosevelt's, of course, hand-picked successor as president. Roosevelt had reluctantly and immediately regretted his agreement not to run for re-election in 1908. So Taft was the person he chose. And Taft had told Roosevelt that he would retain his cabinet and move on. Well, immediately after the election, of course, Taft decided, no, I want my own cabinet, and Theodore Roosevelt felt very betrayed by that. But being Taft, he also was very slow to tell these people that, which really made Roosevelt mad. This is recounted very well in Doris Kearns Goodwin's book, The Bully Pulpit. So the two of them were very different. Of course, they had extraordinarily different concepts of the presidency, which I'm not going to repeat here. Roosevelt, the stewardship theory, and Taft, the magistrate theory, which were Roosevelt, the president can do anything that the Constitution doesn't ban, and Taft saying there is no residuum of authority beyond the authority listed in the Constitution of the United States. Sounded like a conservative Chief Justice, which he later became. Franklin Roosevelt. The inter-party transition for Roosevelt was a classic inter-party. In fact, Richard Finno, in his famous book, The President's Cabinet, uses Roosevelt kind of as the prototypical transition president. You try to get people who represent different parts of the party, the liberals and the conservatives, different regions of the country. You try to assure Wall Street by appointing a Wall Street regulator as your Secretary of the Treasury. You try to reassure the Farm Belt by appointing a farmer as your Secretary of Agriculture. You try to reassure the West by appointing a Westerner as your Secretary of Interior. And Roosevelt did all those things. He was the ultimate pragmatic politician. But his cabinet was not built to push the New Deal, although he expected his appointees to push the New Deal. And in fact, they all towed the line and seemed to do that pretty well. The second term presidency of Franklin Roosevelt, he was not interested in bureaucratic reform. He was interested in the court packing plan. And we have had conversations about that, so I'm not going to try to repeat that conversation right now. But if there are any questions, of course, we'll be glad to try to answer it. The third term transition is really the most important transition in the Roosevelt presidency. And of course, it's characterized by John Nance Garner leaving really mad because he thought Roosevelt would step aside and let him run for president in 1940. Just a footnote here as a loyal Texan, boy, would that have been a disaster. But Garner's mad. He just gets pissed off and goes back to Uvalde, Texas, never to return to Washington. In fact, never to leave Uvalde and his Jack Daniels again. He always smoked cigars and drank Jack Daniels whiskey. He said that because he drank only bonded whiskey, he'd live to be 90. In actuality, he lived to be 99. So he drank a quart of bourbon a day his entire adult life. These are fun stories about John Nance Garner. So if he looks like an old drunk, it's because he was. The third term transition, though, was a very important one because it was the shifting of Roosevelt, as one biographer said, from being Dr. Fix the Economy to Dr. Win the War. And so what you see is a recasting of the Roosevelt presidency for the third term. It shows up in a variety of ways. The most important, of course, is Garner and Jim Farley leaving the cabinet because they're mad over the third term, and he is replacing them with loyalists. The final realization of his court-packing desires when in very short order in 1939, 1940, and 1941, he gets Frank Murphy to Attorney General. He then appoints Murphy to the court when a vacancy occurs, and then he replaces Murphy with Robert Jackson. And Jackson serves a very short time as Attorney General and is promoted to the Supreme Court as well. And that's when Francis Biddle becomes his final Attorney General. And then, of course, there was the very political act of appointing Henry Stimson and Frank Knox as his Secretaries of War and Navy. They were both card-carrying Republicans. Stimson had served in the Taft, Harding, and Coolidge administrations as a cabinet member, and of course Frank Knox had been Alf Landon's running mate for vice president in the 1936 election. And so he was trying to recast this as a bipartisan war effort. And those were two very high-profile appointments to accomplish that. Finally, the transition into the fourth term came when Roosevelt ran for the fourth term. Henry Wallace was pushed out as his vice president, and Harry Truman became president. The only cabinet transition in that particular election was the cabinet transition to when Jesse Jones got fired as Commerce Secretary and got really huffy about it. But it was because Roosevelt was trying to create a position for Wallace, who he had rejected as vice president. So in conclusion, Franklin and Theodore Roosevelt were a mutual admiration society. They were both progressives, even though they were from different political parties. In terms of transitions, we see some similarities with the post-institutional presidency, but some dissimilarities as well. These were personal presidents, not institutional presidents. So the shifting was not as systematic as you might see in a post-institutional presidency era. They were obviously very important personalities, and both of them have had a large impact on the U.S. presidency. It's interesting that when you read biographies of both presidents, very often they are called by their biographers or observers as the founders of the modern presidency. And in some kind of ways, they both really were. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Questions? Sure.
You mentioned Doris President's book and Edmund Morris, but did you visit any institutions to consult archival documents during the course of your research at all?
I did not for this paper. I have been in the papers of both TR and FDR at different times, but I did not for this paper.
Right in the back.
Two observations, one of the interactions papers, and two with regard to the APSA protocol responsibility party system. View of the modern certification regarding practice politics generally and the Republican Party specifically, it points out the wisdom of the old adage, be careful what you wish for.
That's right. Great minds will think alike. Yeah,
It's exactly what I said, man.
I mean, exactly, very true. I mean, we can, of course, nowadays we can look at, back at Franklin Roosevelt. It's sort of the Machiavellian, perhaps at times immoral aspects of the presidency and party leadership. How could he claim to be trying to develop a more liberal Democratic Party and, intentionally ignore, for the most part, as president, the whole issue of civil rights, for African Americans, and so what he could to appease Southern Democrats on racial issues. But at the same time, as a party leader, if you have a combination of liberals and conservatives and moderates in your party, okay, it's going to force you obviously to compromise and negotiate among them, besides negotiating with the opposing party. But yeah, exactly in terms of what's happened today. I have to tell my students at times, I'm not lying to you. Once upon a time, there were these creatures who were known as liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, long, long ago. That, what happens if you get to the point where government just becomes, especially in Congress, it seems to just become dysfunctional? Because if you want to talk about, Texas politics, an old saying, I think it was from Jim Hightower, the only thing in the middle of the road are yellow lines and dead armadillos, right? So in the middle of the road, you're going to get hit by traffic on both the left, on both the left and the right. In terms of actually getting that, is that what we really want? Have two major parties, one that, at least in national politics, is very liberal, the other is very conservative, and as matters of principle, they increasingly refuse to negotiate with each other. I remember reading a few, digressing a bit, but I mean, this is the point of all this, reading a biography of Dan Rostenkowski, of course, eventually ends up in prison after the House Ways and Means Chairman for a while. But when he and Bob Michael, who eventually became House Minority Leader and almost became Speaker of the House, but then Newt Gingrich pushed him aside, both from Illinois, one a Democratic congressman, the other Republican, they used to drive back and forth together between Illinois and Washington, D.C., sharing motel rooms together, eating meals together. And we don't hear about Democrats and Republicans in Congress doing that anymore, eating meals together, playing golf, or really, talking to each other. So perhaps, the APSA report ultimately came true. Maybe what TR and FDR really wanted, a very liberal party and a very conservative, eventually came true. But is that
I think there are two kind of differences, two things. One is, I think the reason that they don't talk to each other as much anymore is primarily because none of them live in Washington anymore. They have the Tuesday to Thursday club. They fly in Tuesday morning, fly out Thursday evening, and aren't really invested in each other in the ways that they used to be. So there's not time for those kinds of relationships in many senses. The second thing is, I think E. Schneider, when he puts together that report from the APSA in 1950, he was still operating under the principle that O'Neill used to tell us about, which is all politics are local. And in fact, what's happened is very different from that. The truth is that now all politics are national. Even mayoral elections now devolve into national politics. So it's a very different climate than Schneider envisioned.
Just to pounce on the idea right there, in Saratoga in upstate New York, a super PAC has put money into the local elections.
Oh yeah, we had a fracking ban in my hometown of Denton, Texas, and it was a local ordinance issue, and the oil companies came in and spent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in that little town to try to defeat the fracking ordinance. It passed. And then they spent millions of dollars overturning it in the state legislature in Texas. So I think just everything's national now.
Other questions? All right, thank you very much, John.